Welcome to Sons of Patriarchy. I'm your host, Peter Bell. Sons of Patriarchy exists to expose the hidden power structures behind Christian nationalism. Through survivor testimonies, shared storytelling, and honest expert critiques from across the political, theological, and cultural spectrums, we shine light on systems of abuse and authoritarian control principally focused on Doug Wilson of Moscow, Idaho, and the movements he has founded and influenced, as well as across Reformed and conservative churches. Our goal is not just to inform, how did we get here, and what do we do about it, but to spark meaningful conversations in homes, faith communities, and public spaces about what a healthier, freer, and more just society can look like. Together, we can dismantle harmful narratives and build communities of mutual respect and diversity. Sons of Patriarchy aims to do what Doug cannot. We will unite people. We do not demand you be like us. We meet you where you are. And while you may not always agree with us, we hope we can agree on this. Churches should be safe. You can find us on all podcasting platforms as well as YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and X, and sonsofpatriarchy.com. Ad-free episodes, bonus content, listening a week ahead of time on both audio and video, monthly Ask Us Anything specials, and many more perks are available across 5 membership levels at patreon.com/sonsofpatriarchy. Much of the same is available via Apple Podcast subscriptions for $4.99 a month. You can give to this work directly at donorbox.com/sons-of-patriarchy. Exclusive Sons of Patriarchy merch is available at sonsofpatriarchy.com/merch. If you'd like to get a hold of us, desire to interview either myself or co-producer Sarah Bader, or you're a news media agency looking for information on Christian nationalism, patriarchy, Doug Wilson, or anything else we covered in this series, go to sonsofpatriarchy.com/contact. Now, on to the episode. In today's episode, we'd like to extend a special shout out to Presbyterian Advocacy Coalition, which is dedicated to providing women in the OPC the help they need to navigate the complexities of the church court system while being their guide and help along the way. A link to their group is in our show notes. Welcome to Millstones, Abuse in OPC, Part 7. In this episode, you will meet Caroline Garcia Osborne and an anonymous woman, both former members of Covenant OPC in Grange, Georgia. These are the two women Theresa Robertson talked about during her episode, Covered Up, Abuse in the OPC, Part 6. This episode, along with Theresa's, should never have happened. Sons of Patriarchy should never have had to exist. Stories from abuse survivors in these churches should never have had to exist. These churches failed. These presbyteries failed. The denominations these churches are in failed. And now I recognize these are harsh words, but when a minister like Boyd Miller is still a minister in good standing at Covenant OPC in Grange, Georgia, when these stories are known, the Presbytery of the Southeast has failed to shepherd their flock. The OPC has failed at weeding out the bad churches in her denomination. Because, as you've heard, this isn't the only church these stories have happened at. These aren't the only women who are telling their stories. I love the OPC, and yet it has failed. In October of 2024, the Presbytery of the Southeast had the opportunity to make it right. And they didn't. They could have disciplined Boyd Miller, stripped him of his credentials, and had hard conversations with those attending Covenant OPC. And yet, they didn't. The members of Covenant OPC are now implicated. They know what happened. And yet, again, they stayed. They're ministered, in scare quotes, by Boyd week to week. No consequences beyond a slap on the wrist. The entire process was followed. Reports were made, Elders were consulted, impact statements taken in. Boyd was interviewed, but they didn't interview everyone. They didn't interview those Theresa, Caroline, and the anonymous woman asked them to. Those who were witnesses, those who would have corroborated their story. Covenant OPC in LaGrange, Georgia, and the Presbytery of the Southeast held a trial. But that trial wasn't to hear the woman. That trial was to exonerate Boyd Miller. And because of this failure, these women have given us at Sons of Patriarchy access to all the documents in their case. Every Facebook message Boyd sent to Caroline when she was a young teenager, their impact statements to the presbytery, the letter from Boyd to the church announcing his resignation, emails from the session of the church, the briefs from the shepherding committee, pictures, and more. Everything will be linked on the Sons of Patriarchy Facebook page by the time you're listening to this episode. So please, go take a look. Let's get started. Here's my full interview with Caroline Osborne.
Yeah, my name is Caroline Garcia Osborne, and my sister shared a lot about our initial intro to Covenant in LaGrange. We came at the invitation of a friend of my parents, who was also a homeschooling family in the community, and they lived about an hour south of LaGrange as well. So they were also making the drive, which I think is what made the invitation more reasonable to my parents, because if they were doing it, it must be worth it. So we started going there. I was 13, I think. And, you know, my first impressions of Boyd specifically, Theresa kind of talked about Covenant as a whole, and I can get into that too. But Boyd was super welcoming. He's a gregarious guy. He's quirky. He's kind of a guy that fills the room. He has a lot of verve. He's just a really loud person. So he was super excited to see us there. He was kind of young for a lead pastor. He would have been in his early 30s at this time. Maybe old for a single pastor. That was definitely a topic of conversation. But he was kind of that perfect median age to be really energetic in making connections with a diverse age of people, all the way from the youngest kids to the oldest elderly people we had there. He was really held in high esteem as an educated, highly qualified Bible teacher. His views and opinions were really sought after from all sectors of the church. You would see him like jumping in young kids' debates, settling some catechism question, to talking with the men of the church who were tossing minor doctrinal points around for sport. And I think this really tiny church in LaGrange was and is really proud of having a pastor who has such a pedigree of education. Theresa mentioned he graduated from Davidson and then continued on through seminary and has a lot of credentials. And I think they were really impressed that a tiny church in a tiny town in the middle of nowhere, Georgia, could get such a great, highly qualified teacher. Yeah, he was really friendly with our family from the start. And we were really quickly enveloped into the warp and woof of the church, if you will. We were kind of the poster children for this particular strain of conservative Christianity. My dad's was a dentist, lucrative career. My mom was able to stay home. They had 8 kids. They homeschooled all of us. My mom likes to say all the way through, but a lot of us did dual enrollment at the college in our senior and junior years. But we were like this well-behaved, we had the most kids in the church, which was a weird competition. Like the next biggest family only had 6 kids and they got like dethroned when we got there. And I was like, MBD, we got 2 more kids than you. So yeah, there was just sort of a culture of venerating those types of things, having a large family, being homeschooled, having a stay-at-home mom, etc. And we already had all of that before we got there. So there wasn't any persuasion that needed to happen. We walked in, locked and loaded. Yeah, for various reasons, none of us had ever been baptized, despite early professions of faith from a lot of us. But after hearing a sermon on infant baptism shortly after arriving at the church, with 8 unbaptized children in tow, the youngest of whom would have been under 2, my father agreed to have all of us baptized in a single Sunday, which solidly solidified our celebrity status. Incidentally, my theology holds that neither man nor mode make the baptism. So despite years of opportunity to be baptized by immersion, and 11 years of marriage to the son of a Baptist pastor, I maintained the integrity of my baptism from that one Sunday at Covenant Pres at the hands of Boyd Miller. So I think that's at least worth saying. Our integration into the church was really quick, and Boyd's integration into our family was just as quick. Before I knew it, we were driving one way an hour 3 times a week to be at the Sunday morning, Sunday evening, and Wednesday night services. And Boyd was joining us out for lunch, which they had a really strong teaching on keeping the Sabbath holy, and eating out was frowned upon because people were working on Sunday in order for you to go to that restaurant. But they made a big deal about making an exception for us because we were out of towners. So Boyd would come out to eat with us. And then on Wednesdays, we would all go to Wendy's together, my dad's favorite fast food place. And he always joined. And then eventually, not that we didn't get invited by other people at church for lunch after the service, but we eventually started being invited to lunch at Boyd's every Sunday to stay through the afternoon to then go to the evening service without having to drive back. So yeah, I mean, that was kind of our 0 to 60 with Covenant Pres.
Awesome. So that was an introduction. Being there at the church, and for those who want to listen to even more, they can hear Theresa's interview at this point, which was 2 weeks ago. So what was the culture like at the church, especially for you? And how were men and women viewed at the church as well?
Yeah. In a lot of ways, Covenant was just like any other small Southern church of its time. Men were standing around talking shop, theology, etc. Women were taking care of kids and prepping the fellowship meal or chatting about their weeks, homeschooling, swapping advice, whatever. And kids were everywhere. I mean, they were playing pickup soccer games in the parking lot. They were running around. They were playing tag, doing all the things. It was, for a small church, a very vibrant, lively community. And I know Theresa has her own perspective on that. And she was also slightly older and a little more mature for her age than I was. There was nothing glaringly, wow, something's off here. It didn't strike me as something that was particularly oppressive or heavy. It struck me as very rigid and structured. And for a kid who was kind of lost in the mix in such a big family, I had a much more receding personality than front-facing. And so I was really excited to find some type of linear metric for success in this church. You would memorize the shorter catechism. You would graduate into the adult Sunday school class. You would get to the point where you could ask questions in the Sunday school class. You could become a communicant member. There were all of these sort of stages that I could mark that I had checked this box and gotten to this next place. And that sort of appealed to me. And so I found my place really quickly as a straight A student at a church. I mean, it was manufactured, but this idea that I was sort of intellectually apt, that I really wanted to learn these big multisyllabic words for theology. I wanted to sharpen my debate skills so I could tell those Arminians what was what. And that whole dynamic was really appealing to me. So the fact that it sort of played neutral, I think plays into the harm of churches like that, because we didn't have people warning us that something might be off with the pastor. We didn't have any sense when we walked in that people were not happy about being there or being dragged. That, from my perspective, it was a fairly vibrant place. And I found a place in that really quickly, specifically in the realm of sort of the Sunday school answer, knowing what the right thing was, sword drill, finding the reference in the Bible first, et cetera, et cetera. So that was, that's my perspective.
Awesome. So you're not on Sons of Patriarchy because everything went fine and dandy, and this is a great church, and you found your spot there. In case people were wondering, I was like, wow, she's speaking really well about Boyd and about the church and about her growth as a Christian. So when did you start questioning? And this is not just the church, but more particularly about Boyd. When you came from, hey, I'm growing as a Christian, I'm arguing, I'm learning, and this is matching kind of my intellectual proclivities. And then you started thinking, what's going on?
Yeah. I wish there was a glaring moment, but this was just such a long, drawn out experience. And I think this is just a good place to tell my story. So a lot of it started with how much Boyd and I interacted in person at the church. At this point, we were going 3 times a week. We were seeing him regularly. It's not a big church. There's not a ton of people other than you to talk to. So it's not like it seemed weird that he was always talking to me. It was just, he was always talking to everybody and we were all there all together all the time.
Yeah.
When the contact started happening outside of church, he, as early as 14, so a year into being there, I was kind of an avid note taker at church, and we were given these notebooks from a OPC conference that had like speaker, title, text, date, and then you would take sermon notes. And so I was frequently doing that really as a brown noser move, if I'm honest with myself. But I got praised for it. Wow, you're so young and you're just really paying attention. I was like, I know, it's just important to be into the word. And so he would call our house and my parents would answer and there would be some chit chat. And then he would have a reason to talk to me. And the most common one was that I was such a good note taker that if he missed something during Sunday school when so-and-so was teaching, he could get the notes from me because Caroline definitely wrote down that missing reference. The idea that he could have called the Sunday school teacher, which would have been an elder or another man in the church, to get that from them was never flagged, never questioned, just, oh, yeah, Caroline will have the notes. Here you go. And those calls got more and more frequent, and we went from talking 10 to 15 minutes to talking an hour, to talking a couple of hours, to talking multiple times a week. It got to the point where the phone would ring and his number would come up on the caller ID, and whoever saw it would just hand it to me. Our conversations were innocuous in some ways, of course. They were just about my day. It would start with something like, well, how's your Bible reading going? We were really into Bible reading plans. Like I read the Bible through in a year, like 6 years in a row, because that was the thing you needed to do. And so he would ask me how I'm doing on that, or how's my prayer life, or whatever pastoral things that he needed to ask me. But there was an increasing sense of familiarity and flattery and specialness in these conversations, not the least of which was demonstrated by the fact that I had 7 other siblings, but they were not the recipient of these phone calls. Mm-hmm. And this really naturally transitioned to preferential treatment at church. I was allowed to join the adult Sunday school class before my peers. I was invited to sit with the adults at meals at Boyd's house instead of being relegated to the kids' table. And there was usually an obvious effort to sit next to me or near me at our potlucks we would have in the second floor of the old church. And I was flattered by that. I was a kid who was not a squeaky wheel in our family, so I wasn't the most likely to get a ton of adult interaction and attention, and he was really feeding that for me. So I enjoyed it. I think back to that, and I also think about the fact that at these tables where I would be invited to sit with adults, I frequently remember getting up and standing behind him and massaging his shoulders. And there would have been my parents, other people at the table watching this, and no one ever said anything. I was never pulled aside and was like, hey, it's nice that you want to massage the pastor's shoulders, but maybe, nothing. It was always just, that's just Boyd. And that is indicative of a lot of very innocuous physical contact. He would often offer me his arm. And when I would take his arm, he would like flex his bicep and make a lot of comments about how strong he was and how big his muscles were. He would talk about his rock hard abs and invite us to like punch them or touch them or feel them. And I will say, this was not just for me. This was for all the kids. Yeah. And he was very playful like that. He was very involved with the kids in the church, very quick to join a soccer game, to join the game of tag, to whatever. And to clarify, this is not the culture at the church. Like, oh, adults are just super into hanging out with the kids and making their games extra fun. It was just Boyd. Boyd was the one who always joined in with the kids stuff, always had a kid near him or around him. And I think it was viewed as like, well, we don't have a youth pastor. We just got blessed with an extra good pastor who does all the ministry. And that was sort of the cover for this type of stuff. And so I remember frequently being invited to like physically interact with him, like feeling his muscles. And he was described as like an overgrown college kid. He wore a lot of like college merch, like hoodies and ball caps and things that sort of played younger than he was. And I think that made it less off-putting that someone in their late 30s would be hanging out with kids to the extent that he was. Yeah, so we frequently sat together at events, at church events, at other events. I was invited to ride in his car on the way between church and our house, or his house and church. And sometimes a sibling rode with me, but oftentimes not. And I would ride with him alone. And I think throughout this period, the grooming was highly effective. If asked, I would have said, I really, really like Boyd. I really enjoy this attention. He thinks I'm really smart. I'm appreciating this. And I think I would have even said, I love Boyd. And to be perfectly clear, Boyd is 22 years older than me. So let's even just call it the median age of 15. He would have been 37.
Yep. And you're underage. So it's not just the age difference. It's you're below 18 years old and he's above 35.
And it's also a status thing because I would have been saying yes, sir, to him during this time. So down south, yes, sir, is a verbal expression of deference and respect and status. And I would have 100% categorized Boyd as a yes, sir. And that dynamic comes into play later as far as like if I were to step out of line or if I were to do something later on in the grooming process, the authority part of our relationship would come back into play. So all of this attention, all of the conversations were fostering a friendship. I say that very loosely. And there was a really natural segue in the grooming process to talking about marriage, and it became more and more frequent. And it was subtle at first, and I want to be very clear about this. He was never quick. He was never aggressive. He was never direct at the beginning. This was a slow burn, a very long process of gaining my trust and my affections to the point that I would silence my inhibitions, my discomfort, my intuition in favor of continuing this stream of affection and attention and preference. He started talking about marriage in really vague terms, like a book he had just finished about Charles and Susanna Wesley's courtship and correspondence. And he would end it with something like, I hope one day the woman I court will exchange handwritten letters with me. And over time, jokes and comments about marriage were extremely commonplace. By the time I was 16, 17, there was almost an assumption that he would make a comment about marriage and it would be about me, congregation-wide, from the kids to the adults. I remember one time in particular, he was out at my parents' house and we were with a bunch of, teenagers. It would have been a bunch of people my age. And he had offered me his arm and we were walking outside and we passed by a wedding invitation on the fridge. And he said, maybe it won't be long before those are from us. So this segued from marriage in general to marriage specifically about the two of us. I would have been 16. He would have been 38. And I was aware that Boyd had ideas of marriage to me in mind. The paradox is, at the same time, I was a teenage girl who viewed marriage as like a really far off thing. My mom was 25 when she got married. So as far as normalizing an age for marriage, I wasn't thinking 18, 19, 20, these are normal ages for marriage. I was thinking you graduate from college, you meet somebody, you get married. So in my mind, even though he was talking about marriage and it was feeling more direct, I was able to kind of rationalize it, but that's so far away. I'm so far removed from being a wife. So even if he feels this way now, that's fine. I don't have to worry about that. And my sister told a story about a Bible that he gave me when I was 15. And I know I was 15 because I kept like a legend at the front in different colored pens and wrote the year that I used that color pen in the Bible. And the very first one is from 2005 in bright red. And his name was at the top, and this is why he couldn't return the Bible, because he'd already written his name in it. And my sister tells the story of one of our teenage friends pranking me by writing Mrs. in front of it. And I remember the prank being like the sort of teasing you do when a girl likes a boy and you say things to make her blush. That was the tone of this. It wasn't like, what a creeper, or like, how weird is this? It was more like teasing two people who kind of know they're into each other, but they haven't admitted it yet, whatever. And I remember that like sticking with me, like, oh, nobody thought that was weird. Like, that's okay. I'm just going to like color it out because I don't want to walk around with a Bible that says Mrs. A. Boyd Miller IV. Yeah, and another notable gift he gave me was monogram stationery, which goes back to the comment about getting handwritten letters from a woman that he courted. So he gifted me monogrammed stationery for my graduation, but he first had asked my parents if he could get me a string of pearls, and they had told him that they really thought that was too much. And shortly after that, we began exchanging handwritten letters. Around this time, I got a personal email account. It was like 2006-ish, when it was cool to have like dreaming big at mchsi.com. And I began receiving emails from Boyd as well. And they started with my mom being CC'd on all of them, or those mass emails that we were all really into in the early aughts with like //, if you love God, pass this on. And there was lots going on in the church between the kids and the grown-ups and the word games and the whatever. Emails were super prevalent. But I was also getting direct emails from him. And my mom was usually CC'd on. And there's a distinct moment in 2007 where that changes, where he's no longer CCing my mom on any of the emails. So this is just building like points of contact that we were having over time, from in person to on the phone to emails to Facebook messages in 2007. But there was also in-person contact that was increasing over time. So in late 2006, my dad started taking us to ballroom dancing lessons. There were free ballroom dancing lessons downtown. And we would go every Thursday night. We'd pick my dad up from work at 5, go to Moe's, eat tacos, go to ballroom dancing lessons. And my dad started inviting Boyd. And I think that in general has been a tone of his defense in all of this, is that my dad was so invitational to him. And to provide some context, my dad was 38 when he met my mom, who is 14 years younger. And he married at 39, and my mom was 25. He felt a lot of empathy for someone who was experiencing prolonged singleness. He saw a lot of himself in Boyd, and he really wanted to show up for him in a unique way because he got it in a unique way. And so he did invite Boyd to a lot of things. We went to baseball games in Atlanta. He came to ballroom dancing lessons. He came to all of our, like, what would have felt like family functions, birthday parties, things like that. Boyd was given kind of a de facto invitation to. So he's not wrong in perceiving that he was invited. I think the end goal of that invitation is what is really misconstrued in his mind. So he started coming to ballroom dancing lessons. He came every week, barring events that had been planned beforehand. And I never doubted in all of this that he was coming for me. By this time, he had been regularly seeking me out for friendship and intimacy and relationship for 2 years. I would have been 16 or 17. He was 38, 39, and he would drive to eat with us and go to the dancing lessons and then drive back to Grange. And I have an email from 2007 that kind of demonstrates this. He says, "C, thanks for coming over yesterday. I'm going to try and have sermons done earlier in the week so I don't hibernate on Sunday afternoons. I mentioned to your dad that y'all can have a standing Sunday invitation at my house if you'd like to stay in Grange. You can utilize it or not any week you want. Are Thursday nights now occupied with rehearsals for the next few weeks instead of ballroom dancing? Let me know. I'd like to schedule visitations those evenings if you're going to be busy those nights. Boyd." I had 4 other sisters, and there were plenty of other women at these ballroom dancing lessons who would switch out partners, but he was only coming if I was going to be there and available to dance. And this is also the point where my mom quit being CC'd on any emails moving forward. This is another email that demonstrates a spiritual element of this conversation. He would frequently ask me about my spiritual life, and he sent this email in February of 2007. Dear Caroline, hope you are well. I have been laboring in prayer for you this morning, along with many other petitions. Talk to you later, Boyd. A 17-year-old receives a personal email from her 39-year-old pastor telling her that he's laboring in prayer for her. The amount of times in the Facebook messages that he tells me that he's been praying for me, or he will be praying for me, or he's going to get off the Facebook chat right now to go pray for me, are numerous. There was a large sense of intimacy built in the fact that when he wasn't with me, he was thinking about me, talking to God about me. So there's a few other direct emails in the month of February, but the culminating event happens at the end of this month. So my birthday's in December. So I had just turned 17, and a friend of our family and boy that I was interested in came to church with us one Sunday. It was a Sunday where we were planning to go to Boyd's house for lunch and stay through to the Sunday service. And this boy joined us de facto because he had come with our family to church. But he left shortly after lunch. So while he was there, Boyd's mood and behavior were obviously affected. He was short in tone and words with many of us children. He opened and shut the drawers and cabinets like really loudly and forcefully. And he was generally unpleasant the entire time. So after the boy had left, our family settled into a typical Sunday afternoon. My parents were napping, kids were playing quietly, and Boyd asked to see me upstairs. Theresa heard that he wanted to see me, and she asked me not to go. But he was waiting for me, and I went. When I stepped into his office, he had me sit down on his couch, and he closed the door. I had been in the study before, but he had never closed the door. And I have to concede that the particulars of this I don't necessarily remember. There are a few quotes that stand out, so I will concede that I am paraphrasing some of these memories. But he sits behind his desk and he says, "Do you have feelings for him?" And I knew that he meant the boy who had come with us. And I answered truthfully, "Yeah, I do. And I'm interacting with him as much as my parents will allow." And he said, "I thought you knew." And I said, "Knew what?" And he said that I love you in every sense of the word, and I have for a long time. And I was shocked. And I just sat there staring at him. And Boyd said something along the lines of it being a woman's prerogative to be silent in these situations. So it was okay if I didn't have a response yet. And he went on to talk about hopes for a future, if I was still single somewhere down the road. He didn't think he had any hope of that, but maybe, perhaps, we could end up together after all. And he was crying during parts of this conversation. He told me that he hoped he would never have to perform my wedding and that it would kill me to see you walk down the aisle to someone else. It became really apparent that I was not going to be able to say anything, so the conversation came to a close. And as I was about to leave, he told me he really didn't think I should mention this to anyone, especially my parents, considering how strongly they had reacted the last time he had given me advice about an issue with them. My dad wanted me to be a dental hygienist. I wanted to go into theater. And he told me, you don't have to be a dental hygienist if you don't want to. Honoring your parents doesn't mean obeying them. And my dad did not love that. So he used that as an example, as a way to say, we probably shouldn't say anything, considering how your dad might react. I don't know if he specifically told me not to tell anybody, but I certainly internalized that this was not something I was supposed to share with people. And that's where the authority part comes back in. So we're peers. I could marry you. You could say yes to marrying me. Now I'm in charge of you and I'm telling you how you should treat this situation. It would be an understatement to say I cried myself to sleep every night for a week. I was in agony. I was imagining a conversation where he asked my dad said yes, and from an adolescent perspective, if you're the child and two adults are talking, making a decision for you, you don't have agency in that situation to say, I'd prefer not to do that. They've made the decision. And I had a real visceral fear that the decision would be made for me and I would simply comply and be a good girl and marry Boyd. And I thought, what can I do that will keep that from happening? So during this time, Boyd had mentioned, will rehearsals keep you from coming to ballroom dancing? I was participating in a show at the Springer Opera House in Columbus, and I was regularly at rehearsals. And honestly, that whole context was a godsend. There were people there who were really outside of our very narrow homeschool conservative view, and they were able to see things that we weren't. And this pastor guy who always comes to your shows, always stands and talks to you afterwards, always, whatever, and you guys talk about him, had raised some red flags amongst the other adults who were at the Springer working with kids, etc. And one of them was Jens Rasmussen. He was a teacher at the Springer at their day camp, the Springer Theater Academy. I had known him since I was a little kid, and he's the same age as Boyd. And he specifically had raised a lot of red flags about Boyd's familiarity, flirting, etc. And he had said to me at one point, he said, you need to be careful because once you're 18, there won't be anything stopping him from marrying you. I thought he seemed crazy. I thought that was an alarmist view of what was happening with Boyd. But after a week of distress following Boyd's advances, I knew who to talk to. And so I went to rehearsal the following week, and Boyd was there. Not to rehearsal, to a show. And Boyd was there. He had bought tickets. He was at that opening night. And I knew it would be a good time to draw the connection for Jens without disobeying Boyd, saying that I couldn't tell anyone. So Boyd was at the reception after the show. Jens was also there. And I went up to Jens and I said, he didn't wait until I was 18. And I knew that he would know who I was talking about and that he would know what I meant. So the next day, while at the Springer, Jens confronted me and asked me questions, and I told him the whole story. I was very emotional. I was overwrought. I cried the entire time. And I was afraid that if my parents or Boyd ever saw how upset it made me, that I was going to get into trouble or be made to feel badly for disappointing Boyd, for not wanting to marry him like he wanted to marry me. And Jens immediately told me that I needed to tell my parents that this had happened so they could contact the appropriate authorities. And that sent me into a panic. I was hysterical. You can't call the police. We can't get Boyd in trouble. That would be so bad. He didn't do anything wrong. I don't know why I feel this way. And Jens was very frank with me. He said, your reaction is scaring me. You sound like a rape victim. And I need you to confirm for me that he has not touched you physically, which I did. His reaction was so wildly out of the norm for me in this whole experience, where most of these overly familiar encounters were dismissed with an attitude of, that's just Boyd. Boyd can't be doing anything that wouldn't be approved of because he's so X. This is an email that I wrote Jens shortly after our talk about me needing to tell my parents. I was 17 at the time, and this is one of the most transparent lenses I have to where my head was at during this time. I say to him, my mom and I did have a conversation in general about Boyd, and she said herself that 22 years was too much. She also mentioned that Dad was slightly concerned about Boyd, leading me to believe that he's not too crazy about the idea either. Boyd never asked me how I felt towards him. I pretty much just sat there and watched him silently. He said that my silence was killing him, but said it was okay to say nothing, so I didn't. Jens, it's not that the potential isn't there, but the age thing is just a bit too much to handle. I mean, it would be like being interested in you. I mean, don't get me wrong, but you. Our different statuses also kind of weigh on me. I mean, he's my pastor. I've also told him that marriages where an age difference that big was acceptable happened a long time ago, and that age is gone now. And he said that he'd thought about it, but he read an article in a magazine somewhere about a basketball coach who married 22 years younger. He used this as an example, saying that age may not be gone. But he didn't seem to think that I would still be single somewhere down the road, as he put it. He just hoped he would never have to perform my marriage. The poor guy, I feel really badly for him, which puts me in a vulnerable position as I know myself and my own willingness to do things to save other people from pain. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I just have a really hard time saying no. If he ever asked me, I do wonder at my own ability to look at him and say no. Not that I think he'll ever even get the chance, since he would have to go through my father. And as I've already said, he's not too crazy about it. What are your suggestions? Should I just leave it be, as he said it won't come up again? Why do you think I should tell my parents? Jens told me after that I had 24 hours to tell my parents, or he was going to. And I did. My father's first words were, "Have you told anyone else about this? Boyd could get into big trouble." He characterized this as an incident of a lapse in judgment. And I lied. I told him I hadn't mentioned it to anyone else. I did not say that I had told Jens. And I felt instinctively that every thought I had had silencing my own discomfort was confirmed in that moment. I'm the problem. I'm the one who's making too big a deal about this. I'm the one who is overreacting. And I also realized if I were to be honest about how I feel, Boyd could suffer consequences, and I really didn't want that to happen. I had a strong impulse to protect him. It struck me, though, that a mentor outside the church thought that Boyd should suffer swift consequences, but it seemed like nobody inside the church wanted Boyd to get into trouble. My sister Theresa told in her story about how after this happened, she printed off that email that I had written to Jens and took it to Jim Channel, a current session member at Covenant and a session member then at the time, and made him read it and said, "This is happening. This is how my little sister feels about it. She's underage. He's too old to be doing this. Who is holding him accountable, et cetera, et cetera." Was dismissed. I was characterized as an attention seeker, as someone who might exaggerate something in order to get Boyd into trouble. He said, I mean, this is hearsay, so forgive me, but he communicated that he'd known Boyd for a long time and he knew Boyd wouldn't do something like this. And it was written off. In the end, it was dealt with privately between my father and Boyd. I think my dad told Boyd to back off, and presumably Jim Channel and Boyd had a conversation, but we have confirmation now that this was never brought to local, like the larger session, the rest of the elders. And there was no talk of filing a complaint or having any type of formal action taken. After this period of time, he was still consistently interacting with me. In fact, the Facebook messages start in the summer of 2007. Our encounter in the office happened in February. So it's actually after this point that he starts engaging me on Facebook a lot. There's over 60 pages of Facebook messages between the two of us that will be available when the relevant documents are posted. But it's after this point when he realizes that he's not going to get anywhere with me. I started actually dating someone my senior year, high school sweetheart. His affectionate attention changed into controlling attention. One of the most notable stories about that was in 2007, that summer. I took a beach trip with my sister Theresa and a friend. In our family, bikinis are not acceptable swimwear, but Theresa was over 18 and not living at home, so she wore bikinis in several pictures that were posted to Facebook. And when we got home, my mother informed me that she knew I'd been wearing a bikini at the beach because Boyd saw the photos on Facebook and called to inform them that I wasn't abiding by the standard he knew they held in their home. Once we got the facts straight, that it had in fact been Theresa wearing the bikini, not me, the fact that their 39-year-old pastor had been scrolling bikini photos on Facebook and felt the need to reach out and talk to my parents about it was never addressed. To highlight some of the messages from Facebook, there's just a couple of patterns, and people can go read these for themselves. One is the amount of times he initiates these messages and not me. And the times where I do initiate the messages, I'm largely coming to him looking for spiritual advice or some type of counsel, asking him to pray for me, telling him about a big test I have coming up. It's pretty clear throughout the messages where I have placed Boyd in a category of spiritual mentor or pastor, but his communication with me does not have that tone all the time. Certainly some of them do, but that's one thing. The second thing is as these messages progress, the timestamps are really significant. He's messaging me at 9 p.m., 10 p.m., 11 p.m., sometimes later. A single man in his home at 11 p.m. at night messaging a teenage girl on Facebook. And a lot of them talked about praying for me. A lot of them talked about spiritual things I need to be doing or checking in on me spiritually, sort of continuation of a previous pattern. But they also were really familiar. We started using nicknames. He started sending lots of smiley faces and silly things. And he would pretty consistently question my very typical early aughts Facebook statuses, which were vague and cryptic and usually like lyrics from Jack Johnson. And he would ask me about them to clarify them. And am I happy? Is something wrong? Tell me what's going on. One of them he sent says, Caroline, he says, sorry you're down after your trip. I almost asked you before you parted. Caroline, are you happy? Truly, my pastor sensors smelled it a mile away. Smiley face, smiley face. I'll pray for you tonight and tomorrow and the next day and the next, etc. Another pattern in these messages that my sister actually helped me see is at one point I'm deep in this debate with my parents on whether or not I should be a dental hygienist or go to theater school, which is what I wanted to do. And they were sort of pulling the honor your parents card, and I was pulling the I'm going to be 18 and probably should be allowed to go to school for what I want to be able to do. But I was also very much a people pleaser, very much wanted to achieve approval and affection based on my actions. If I could just do something the right way, I could make it all good. I could make them proud of me. I could make them love me. So I was really drawn to this idea of becoming a dental hygienist from a martyr mindset, like God will know I didn't want to do this, but he'll also know I was honoring my parents. And Boyd kind of swooped in that situation and was really encouraging me to not feel the pressure to become a dental hygienist, to spend 2 years of my life learning a skill that I didn't want to use professionally, et cetera, et cetera. And I felt really connected to him. Like, wow, somebody sees my struggle. Somebody sees me and obviously my immense potential to be a professional actress. And he was kind of on side in that. But then if I read through a lot of our Facebook messages, anytime we talked about theater, he was really discouraging. Theater, oh, that's a really worldly thing to do. Oh, I heard a story recently about somebody's sister who's in theater and she's not living a Christian life. Oh, I've heard it's really hard to make money doing that. So he was simultaneously discouraging me from pursuing education to be a dental hygienist because that wasn't my dream, and discouraging me from pursuing my dream to go to school for theater. But there was never an option C where I would go get a formal education. And that is glaring to me now when I look back. There was just no encouragement to pursue higher education at all. I could just learn everything I needed to know theologically from Covenant Pres. People can read these messages for themselves, but at some point I come to him asking like for spiritual advice, and I'm talking about a friend who's like backslidden and how do I encourage them to read their Bible. And he brings up sexual sin as a reason that a lot of people backslide, and sort of opened the door to that conversation, which looking back now, I realize I hadn't said anything about sexual sin. I had not brought that tone into our messages at all, ever. And he introduced that to me as a reason someone might be backsliding, talking about how it's a sin against their own body. And that tone of him introducing that continues in this controlling energy as he starts to police my profile pictures. He sends me this message: your photo. I was hoping you and your conscience might have suspected my veiled meaning. Publish it as a news item. Anyway, I think the photo looks a little too sultry for you, dear Caroline, like models who look as though they don't exactly have heaven and God's glory on their minds. Read 1 Peter 3:1-6 on the godly woman. Notice what the New Testament says about Sarah, who was also a beautiful woman. Love you. I have since searched for the Facebook profile picture that he is referencing, and I couldn't find it, which tells me that I did in fact take it down. And this continued into when I began posting profile pictures of me and my high school sweetheart. And he would regularly ask me to take those pictures down because I'm tired of looking at him. And when I asked, aren't you a little too old to be jealous of the boys in my life? His response is, yes, it's lighthearted, but I'm jealous just the same. Who wouldn't be? Smiley face, smiley face. I'll just direct people back to those Facebook messages to see the breadth of what I'm talking about as far as being very directly flirtatious and jealous and possessive and controlling in those later messages, including after I turned 18. He was sending those messages. They stop abruptly in July of 2008, which I have some theories as to why that is the case, but I don't have any hard evidence. But there are no more messages after my 18th summer. So picking back up in the narrative of where we are in the church, my parents did allow us to choose our own church at 18, but my younger sister, Sarah Ann, she's 16 months younger than me, and she still had another year and change before she would be 18. And she really wanted me to wait for her to leave so we could leave together. And that meant that every Sunday I attended Covenant in the next 18 months, I was faced with my abuser and the men who protected him, knowing that they either thought I was a liar or didn't care to find out if I was or not. What happens next is from the ages of 18 to 23. So this is categorically out of the underage segment of the grooming, but very much in line with the tone and dynamic that had been put into place earlier in my life. At 19, I quit attending Covenant, started going to a church in Columbus full time. And around this time, I met a 19-year-old boy, a boy my own age. We worked at Chick-fil-A together, and we started seeing each other. And I told my parents about him, and we were planning time for all of us to meet. And a photo was posted of the two of us on Facebook before that could happen. Boyd found his profile, scrolled through over 600 photos and 4 years worth of posted pictures to find one from when this young man was 15 years old with a penis painted on his chest at a high school football game. He immediately called my parents to inform them and advised that no daughter of theirs should be involved in any way with a young man like this. My father told me I wasn't to speak to or see this young man again outside of work, ever. The young man made an appointment with my father at his office to clear the air and ask for a proper chance to make a first impression instead of his 15-year-old pictures on Facebook. But the deed was done. My dad never changed his mind after repeated efforts over the next 2 years. In 2013, when I was engaged to be married to my now husband, Oki, there were several conversations in which I requested Boyd not be present at my wedding. My parents were still attending Covenant at this time. At first, I basically said, I'm not a member of his church. I have control over the guest list. You can invite your friends, close friends, whatever, but please don't invite Boyd. And they made it clear that they definitely intended to invite him despite my request. And so I made a really emotional plea to my mom, and I reminded her about what happened when I was 17, about how he had used the phrase, "It would kill me to see you walk down the aisle," to someone else. That had been echoing in my brain ever since the day he said it. And I really thought that she understood. She seemed very with me in that moment. So I thought everything was fine until his RSVP came in the mail, along with a wedding gift of almost $700 worth of items off my wedding registry. After that, on the day of my wedding, at 23 years of age, even after 2 of my sisters confronted Boyd, I got married out at my parents' house, on our property and asked him to leave. They communicated to him that the bride did not want him there. He stayed, and I walked down the aisle with Boyd watching, admiring a celebration, the photos of which I struggle to look at with joy to this day. I could talk about all the rest of the times that Boyd has been around our family up until 2017 when my parents left, where I would feel hypervigilance, an overwhelming sense of powerlessness, like a gut instinct to escape or to run away or to find somewhere else to be. He was at my brother's wedding in 2019. He has been around. He called me multiple times in 2017 when my parents eventually left the church, asking for forgiveness, which he had done before, and I had verbally granted him forgiveness. I don't know how many times, But he wanted that to mean that everything was okay and that I would encourage my parents that he could be in our lives again because I was fine. And I couldn't give him that. And I told him that I can never go back to a place where you're around. And this was in 2018. I'd been married for 5 years. I had 2 kids, and I'm sitting in my living room talking to Boyd and telling him how forgiveness doesn't mean that everything's fine. And up until May of 2023, this has just been the story. It was ignored and dismissed and forgotten, but I have carried it now for 20 years. I have navigated the effects of undue influence, of gaslighting, of dismissed my opinion and ideas being dismissed because of my gender, because of my age, as the most tender years of my girlhood were stolen and tainted and irreparably damaged by Boyd Miller. And my years of spiritual formation after leaving Covenant have been marked by a brutal battle to believe in the goodness of God, that he sees me and cares about me, and to remain steadfast in my faith so I can heal from the pain that this has caused me. Because 17-year-old Caroline did not have me, but she does now.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your story. And I'm curious, you've answered a lot of these questions, and I'll ask them slightly different ways. When all this attention was happening, and you noted that there were jokes around you and Boyd amongst the teenagers and kids. I'm curious, did outside of your father or elders, did anybody else in the congregation notice the attention you were receiving and attach that? How did they explain it? Was it, this is just kind of normal, this is what Boyd does? I know he's kind of like one of the kids, kind of like having a youth pastor. But did they notice the special attention given to you and to your sisters as well?
Yeah, I guess because I don't have any like forensic evidence that they did, I can't say with 100 certainty. Certainly there's plausible deniability, but I don't know how they couldn't have noticed it. And certainly it felt very much like a looking the other way, there was such a culture around Boyd that sort of precluded there being anything untoward. It wouldn't even be imaginable. He's so gifted. He's such a great preacher. He's such a strong man of the Lord. It was almost like just the power of denial. Like you're seeing it, you're witnessing it. And we've heard now since then that at least 2 of the elders that we talked to after this came up for a formal complaint, both admitted that they saw things. They saw things happening. And they chose to, I guess, believe the best about Boyd, believe that what they were seeing, they were putting that on him. He wasn't demonstrating that. And I also really think that in general in these communities, there's a stereotype for, I'm going to use a really triggering word. There's a stereotype for pedophilia. It's the windowless van. It's the creeper luring your kids with candy. It's the stranger. There really wasn't an understanding at the time culturally about how the majority of these cases happen with trusted adults in places of authority inside a community. And also because the attention was being given to these adolescent girls, these kind of post-pubescent girls. And pedophilia has subsets. You can Wikipedia them, hebephilia, ephebophilia, like these ideas that 11 to 19 is still an age range where sexual predators can land. It doesn't always have to be this sort of grotesque little girl thing. There's a lot of stories and evidence that that is not the case. And I think because it wasn't the stereotype, it was written off.
Yeah, that makes sense. And also I think people are either conditioned to or don't want to believe the contrary, that their amazing pastor is capable of some of these things. And so it will be reinterpreted through that lens, that we have a great pastor, therefore anything we hear to the contrary is not evidence to the contrary. It's somebody else has a different view and they're just trying to destroy this or whatever it may be. So you got away as you got older and moved away and started doing your own life. And you talked about this, and I want to help listeners think through this. And reason why I ask this is there's an assumption, maybe not an assumption. I think people want like a pretty little bow on these stories, especially with Christians. Christians want a pretty little bow. Like Caroline's faith is now completely restored in the church. She is totally and entirely been healed and has no more trauma around the Bible, has no more trauma around preaching, has no more trauma around male pastors. But if you can, and this is just a personal question, feel free to get as deep or as surface as you want. How has this not impacted as in past impacted, but how does this continually impact you in your faith, your view of the church, your view of God, your view of pastors, and your view of yourself?
Yeah. When I first got away from Covenant and entered another church context, it was really different. There was a lot of contrast. It was, they had drums, they had instruments other than a piano. The preaching was energetic in a different way. There was a lot of appealing, like, oh, I feel like I'm discovering church as an adult. And I got really involved, went really deep, really fast, and formed a lot of strong relationships with the pastors at that church. I was on the youth leader team. I did that for years. I left, 19 to 22, so 3 years. And I had a really strong relationship with this youth pastor at this church. And I was dating guys at this point, like a normal person. And some of them would meet my parents, some of them wouldn't. But I was introduced to a guy at this church who was a really new believer and was really excited about sharing his testimony. So he volunteered frequently to share his testimony at youth group, at the church at large, at meetings, etc. And he kind of gained this reputation. He was really charismatic, very likable. He was quite a few years older than me. And he kind of gained this reputation as being a really eligible bachelor. And this youth minister kind of encouraged me to not pursue him, but to be open to the idea of him pursuing me if we were to get set up, et cetera, et cetera. And that really quickly progressed into a dating relationship with this man. And it didn't take long for me to realize under the surface, he was incredibly abusive. He was mean. He was mentally and emotionally abusive to me. He made comments frequently about how I was slutty because I would sit crisscross applesauce at youth and that the youth boys could see my crotch, and didn't I know that that was making them stumble and I was being a stumbling block, and obviously I was being a stumbling block to him and I was causing him to lust, and it's my fault that he's having all of these sexual urges. And he always made it so that I had to say, no, we're stopping here. These are my boundaries, whatever. And then he would always push past those and then blame me for that. And I know for a fact that this previous experience with Boyd conditioned in me this innate silencing of my discomfort, of my intuition, of my gut, if it was in a church context. In other dating contexts, if I got a sense that a guy disrespected me, that he wasn't a follower of the Lord, that he wasn't whatever, it took me 2.5 minutes to say, that's it, thanks so much, next. But this guy was revered by church leadership. And I don't think that this is true, but I internalized that if I were to say to somebody, behind closed doors, he's very sexually aggressive, and then he blames me for it. Behind closed doors, he's very mean with his words and makes me feel really uncomfortable. I thought they won't believe me. They'll think, no, he's up in front of the church all the time sharing his testimony about how God's changed his life. Like, maybe you are just exaggerating. Maybe you're reading too much into it. Maybe you're too sensitive. And we didn't even date for that long, maybe 6 to 9 months. But it was so aggressive and so pervasive in our relationship that that relationship ended in date rape. And I came to this trusted youth pastor and shared this story with him. And God bless him, I really think he was doing his best. But the words he said to me were, "I'm so sorry that's how you lost your virginity." And I internalized that. Really, I mean, I had been such a goody two shoes up to this point and was in a completely different church context, had a complete and total, this can't be anything like covenant because it's so different externally, only to be met with my very own same instinctual fears that no one will believe me if I tell them that this man of God is not acting like a man of God. And then to have that kind of confirmed. It wasn't that he wasn't compassionate. It wasn't that he wasn't willing to help me. He did eventually get out of me that I perceived this as rape, or at the very least of being taken advantage of, because it was not what I wanted, and I communicated that. But at the same time, there was sort of this tone of like, it's so sad when these things happen. We'll talk to him too. Obviously, we think both of you should take a break from youth leadership. And we were both given similar, I don't want to say consequences, but in effect, the natural consequences. And mine was couched in healing, and his was couched in, we're going to check with him for fruits of repentance. But we both experienced the same distancing from the church after this happened. And it wasn't but a couple months later that he had shown fruits of repentance and was wearing a church polo collecting offering on a Sunday morning. I still find myself to be naively trusting of people in religious context. I fight the urge to fall back into that, like, if I can just do this right this time, it won't blow up. If I can just know the right answers, if I can be godly enough, if I can read my Bible enough and have enough biblical literacy. I mean, the full transparency is, in having even just listened to some of this content that's come from Covenant since my sister's episode dropped, I have wrestled with if they just knew that I was a good Christian, if they just trusted that I was a Christian, they would listen to me. They would believe me. They would hear this the way I'm saying it. They would know that this is true. They would, whatever it is. And I can truly say the only savior in this situation is Jesus. My faith has not been without its deserts, without its deep depressions, where I have questioned the goodness of God. I have questioned his sovereignty. If he's good, maybe he just couldn't keep this from happening. If he's sovereign, maybe he just wasn't good enough to stop it. And to find my way through that, to see the suffering servant, to see Jesus weeping with me and for me, and also promising me redemption and restoration for me and all of creation at the end of time. And that this isn't forgotten, this is not lost, that when it's held in his hands, nothing is ever truly lost. And I can honestly say I have a stronger faith now than I did when all of this was happening, when I was like a little devout 14-year-old slaying people with my Bible knowledge. I mean, it has truly been a journey of walking with the Lord through this as I come to grips with it, and through the counsel of my husband and a beautiful marriage and months of therapy, bringing me to these realizations, to even be able to see connections between a sexual assault in college and the patterns of spiritual abuse that I had been conditioned with at a younger age that led me right back into that same pattern as a 22-year-old. I think I've answered your question.
No, that's really helpful. It just provides some context for those listening, and then also other women who are listening and realizing that this may be their story too. So same as Theresa, your story and your testimony was part of a trial at the end of 2024. The Presbyterian of the Southeast and Covenant OPC and Boyd and everybody else is part of this. How did that go? Because I know they asked you for your testimony. They asked another person for their testimony, which we'll have her on soon. I won't name her. And then Theresa, your sister. So all this stuff, as far as I know, and as far as you know, came out, and yet Boyd is still a pastor. Mm-hmm. And so if you want to talk about either in brief or in full, How did that go? How did the trial go, and how on earth is he still a pastor to this day?
The short answer to that is the OPC's Book of Church Order. Whenever we asked them a question that sort of pressed into that, very dynamic, sort of trying not to lose the forest for the trees, because there are lots of trees in this story. But whenever we would zoom back out and say, okay, but let's maybe set some of those particulars aside, doesn't this warrant some type of reaction, some type of consequence, some type of... And the answer was always just right there, somewhere in the Book of Church Order. And they could quote that to us or direct us to the section. But then whenever we would question their responsibility personally, how do you personally justify working with him, knowing that he's a fellow minister of the gospel, et cetera, all of a sudden they just like couldn't quite remember what the Book of Church Order might say about their responsibility, or what maybe they were supposed to do, or maybe had authority to do. Who can say? That's hard to know. I don't know about precedent. I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge. There was a lot of that. Yeah, so that's the short answer. The long answer is going to be posted in a transcript of our 3.5-hour debrief of this with them, where we had conferred for many hours together to compile a list of questions that not only probed the actual happenings of this investigation, but sort of the premise surrounding the idea that this can come to light and he can still be allowed to be a pastor, because that had been conveyed to us before this debrief. And I want to say, it wasn't all negative. There's one thing that I can say that I was actually relieved to find. To their credit, the OPC Presbytery of the Southeast did not once request that in order to properly deal with this, we reference Matthew 18, that we confront Boyd privately and seek reconciliation. Okay. They did not in any way suggest that that would have been more appropriate than what ended up happening. I don't know how trauma informed they are on the whole, considering how the rest of this went, but they seem to have an understanding that a victim should not have to face their abuser in order to honor Matthew 18's conflict resolution guide. They understood their roles as representatives of the grieved party. They expressed our thoughts and feelings to him indirectly, and we were not, not that it wasn't offered, like, would you want to receive a letter from Boyd? Would you want to be on a Zoom meeting with Boyd? But when the response to that was absolutely not, there was no pressure that in order to do this rightly, to be a good Christian, that they had in any way in mind that we should be held to that. And that's a real pro, because I have heard horror stories about abusers being given the right of confrontation by their victims in order to raise this to the next level. That's pretty much the only good thing that I can say about how this was handled. There was a lot of kind of gentle words and tones and signs of empathy and signaling that they really saw us and understood how painful this was. But in the same breath, they would very succinctly let us know they did not have any plans to do anything about this further. They did not, other than to commiserate with us in how terrible it is that he's still a pastor. There was no attitude at all that they would have to do anything to change that they should do anything to change that. They had gone as far as the Book of Church Order would allow them. The amount of times that they referenced that as a system constraint, there's just nothing we can do. The system constrains us. We're just working within the framework we have. We brought up a document that was, it's a report to the General Assembly from the summer of 2024. It was titled Equipping Shepherds to Protect the Flock. Yep.
Yeah. The woman who will remain nameless, she told me about this article. It's like, it's actually really good.
Yes, it actually is. When we found it, we were like, guys, this could be a silver bullet, because it seems like it references in detail many of the things that we're bringing allegations about, and they seem to have a framework within which to hold that information and act on it appropriately.
Exactly. It's much in their ability to, and yet they didn't.
And there was so much rationalization and justification given for why they wouldn't be following that document. I can't tell you how many times we were told, although some real page turner can go through that document and count the amount of times that we were told it's not a binding document. It can be referenced, it can be a guide, but there was no expectation that pastors would be adhering to what the report suggested that they do about these predators. So even though we would go point by point on what a groomer was, and we would reference anecdotes from our allegations that supported that he checked the box on that, we would come to the end of it and they would remind us that this isn't a binding document. But the most egregious of those dismissals of our claims was when we went back and forth with Nathan Trice on the legal ramifications of using the word grooming and sexual battery in the case of the other victim. And we asked them why they didn't use that language, because they confirmed they did not. In communication with the session, in communication with the congregation, they used language of sin, indiscretion, imprudence, lack of wisdom, forgoing completely that those are also disqualifying things for a pastor that should be very alarming, but they did not use legal language, quote unquote. And Hank Belfield gave this explanation. He said, we're a court of the church, so we're dealing with the church, and the church is dealing with the moral category of sins. So we wanted to focus on the idea of sins. Some of those other terms have civil and legal ramifications for them. And I said, I have to push back a little bit because you're talking about two different courts, the legal court and the court of the church. But according to a report that was made to the General Assembly, the church uses this language to describe these events in the courts of the church. It's a report called Help to Equip Officers to Protect the Flock. I can cite a bunch of things, but they listed grooming, sexual predators, sexual abuse, and this language is not relegated to legal courts only. And Hank Belfield responds, to put a finer point on it, I don't have the expertise as a minister to say with absolute certainty on the legal ramifications of these things. So we opted to stick to the categories that we felt were indisputable. And that's the idea of sinning against members of the church. When pressed as to why they wouldn't use the word grooming, Nathan Trice jumps in and says, grooming, according to this same document, has to end in sexual satisfaction. That's the goal of the grooming. And I said, are you saying that marriage is not a sexually satisfying relationship? And you're essentially saying the definition of grooming only applies if marriage is not the goal of the grooming. Because the other signs, if I'm reading from your document, seems overly interested in a vulnerable individual, frequently initiates and creates opportunities to be alone, becomes fixated on a child, displays favoritism towards one child, finds opportunities to buy a child gifts, caters to the interests of a child, even acts like a child. He checks every one of those. I don't think that's in dispute. But you're saying as long as his intention in that was to marry me, all of those things can be approved. Nathan Trice says, I'll just say, I do think there's a way of defining grooming. I don't think this is how those on this call are doing it, but I do think there's a way of defining grooming that would rule out any ordinary courtship process, any kind of pursuit of a romantic relationship. Where we saw Boyd's serious indiscretion and sin was in pursuing elements of that with someone who was not old enough to be a recipient of that, and we heard that as his great offense. So legally, this would have been criminal activity. Since we're not experts, we're going to call it sin. And even that is due to the constraints of the system. It's been over 2 years since that happened. So we simply can't, quote unquote, find grounds for discipline based on the allegations that have been brought.
Yeah. And the lowering of the language too, the vocabulary, he won't use pedophilia. He won't use grooming. He won't use 38-year-old having sexual feelings towards a 16-year-old. He won't use that stuff. He'll just say sinning against a member, which can be very innocuous because that could be a 38-year-old against a 36-year-old or whatever it is instead of between a minor and an elder.
And he had sort of cornered me in our initial interview with the shepherding committee where they took my impact statement. And he said, was there anything in your communication with Boyd that if the two of you had been of the same age or you had been of legal age for you guys to be dating, was there anything, if it had been like that, that was inappropriate? Anything lewd, anything overtly sexual, etc.? And I said, before I answered the question, I said, I'm going to answer this, but I do not want this answer to be held against me based on ignoring the fact that it was happening with a 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old. He said, oh, I understand. And I answered the question. No, there weren't. If you're asking if there were inappropriate photos being shared or if he was soliciting sexual conversation from me, the answer is no. And he was like, okay, we just really want to hone in on the specific sins that were committed. And then in reality, absolutely weaponize that against me because this was so early in the grooming process, because there had not been an evident escalation with me into physical and sexual contact. This could simply be written off. He just wanted to marry somebody who was a little too young.
Yep. That was his only crime. Yeah. So last question, which is not really a question, more final thoughts, and similar to what I asked Theresa, your sister. If you can talk to women who are listening to this or men who are listening to this, to pastors or to Covenant, to Boyd, final thoughts, anything that you would like to leave listeners with, or if you want to speak directly to anybody, this is your floor.
Okay. To women or young girls who might find themselves relating to my story, I was 19 before I could correctly have categorized this as grooming. I was sitting in a mandated reporters training for the theater where I was about to teach third and fourth graders. And they were going through things to keep an eye out for. And they talked about the types of people that fall into this category, ourselves included as teachers, but they talked about coaches. They talked about adults who have children that are your, friends' ages, etc. And they mentioned clergy. And they talked about these building a close relationship, creating familiarity, breaking boundaries, all those types of things. And at 19, I was sitting in that training and I had a panic attack because I realized for the first time that is what I had experienced. And I would not have been able to see that before. So if you're listening to this and recognizing something about your experience, there is a spectrum. And one of the reasons I want to share mine is because specifically in mine and Theresa's and the third woman who's going to come forward, there's a clear progression, but it's across different people. It does not negate the escalation of this offense, but my story is in the middle ground. It's not on this high end of severity as far as physical contact, but you shouldn't be penalized for speaking up before the abuse becomes severe. There are people who will listen to you and will believe you. And I know the agony of being disbelieved, but I would plead with you, if the first person doesn't believe you, and do something, keep telling people. I also want to shatter the illusion that I am sitting here as a fearless, brazen truth teller who's just out there trumpeting this story so that other people can know. I am scared to death sharing this story right now. My heart is beating so fast. I am not in any way some lion who is out here roaring and feeling no fear. So if you're thinking, I can't do what she's doing because I'm way too afraid, just know I am doing this scared. An Ellie Holcomb song that I have really clung to is from her 2017 album, Red Sea Road. It's called Fighting Words. And she talks about how the enemy tells us lies. Who are you to speak the truth? Just look at all your failures and mistakes. And then she says, I will use my fighting words and I will sing the truth into the dark. And that's what I'm doing. I am singing the truth into the dark. And I will refuse to believe the lies that this makes me less of a Christian, that this makes me less godly, that I've somehow been out of order in the way that I've addressed this, when I went to the people who could have helped when I was young, and they failed me. And it has taken 20 years for me to be the adult who can look back and help me. And the last thing that I want to say is to Boyd. I want to say this publicly for anyone to hear, but this is for you specifically. I harbor no ill will towards you. This isn't about speaking well or ill of anyone, because we know that profuse are the kisses of an enemy, but faithful are the wounds of a friend. In an effort to speak the truth in love, you've heard now, indirectly, from myself and others who have reported your sins. You've received counsel from your session and your presbytery as to the wise, the right course of action, a resignation from your post. And in response to that, you verbalized an assent to the rightness of the counsel and the wisdom therein. Yet when the time came for you to follow your words with action, they yet again were found to be at odds. I know there's systemic margin for your actions to be allowed, as they obviously were. But we both know having the right to do something doesn't make it the right thing to do. It's James who says it like this in chapter 4, verse 16. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. The issue we're presented with here is the disqualifying nature of your sins for the post you hold as a shepherd of the flock. You have been tasked with its protection, not its predation. In that you failed, not once, not twice, but over and again. I recognize that things take time to come to light and that you may find yourself bewildered that this still haunts you. Welcome to the party. I find myself wondering that frequently as well. But as it has come to light, not by my initiative whatsoever, the onus is once again on you to do the right thing, the thing advised, encouraged, and counseled to you by your peers. I recognize that this will incur a level of suffering for you, but there's a difference in suffering for doing good and suffering that you bring on yourself. 2 Peter 2:19-20 puts it this way. For this is a gracious thing, when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. But what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? Boyd, it's too late to undo the damage that you caused those little girls. This little girl. But it is not too late to take responsibility for your sins, accept the consequences, and demonstrate the godliness you so prize. What are you afraid of? What reputation did Christ not crucify with him on the cross? What dignity did he not lose in his suffering? What name was not mocked in the public square? You won't be suffering more than your Savior, but at least he didn't deserve it.
Groomed, selected, all by a man 20 plus years her elder, while she was between the ages of 14 and 17. Her pastor, he who was commissioned to watch over and care for her soul, did everything he could to lay the seeds for intimacy. Thankfully for Caroline, he never went beyond those messages and hints at marital union. But with the next woman, he went further. He touched her. Here's her story.
So first of all, I started attending Covenant OPC in Grange when I was just 6 months old. I was infant baptized there, and I do not remember another church before Covenant. I don't remember my life without Boyd in it. Looking back on my time there, I am a people pleaser, and I'm also a people person. So I memorized the shorter catechism at least 3 times. I memorized tons of psalms and scriptures. I came to know the Lord there as a child when I was 9 years old, and later I professed faith there and became a communicant member at 14. So I always, as a child, first impressions, looked up to Boyd. I thought he was so smart, so knowledgeable about the scriptures. He was the spiritual authority in my life. He was always playing with the kids. He was silly. He was playful, affectionate.
And then what was so that was like attending and getting to know Boyd. What was the culture like at Covenant OPC? And in addition to that, how was Boyd viewed at the church? Maybe from your earliest memories, from being a little girl, what was that like? What'd you see? What'd you feel? And what was the kind of the general consensus around this too?
Okay, so the general culture of Covenant OPC, I would say, placed a high value on biblical education, knowledge, theology, reverence of the Lord. There was some innate distrust of emotions and feelings there. And I think some of that's from in Jeremiah, where it talks about the heart is deceitful and it's wicked above all else. So I think they use that specifically talking about emotions and feelings. I think some of the culture there was legalistic and strict regarding the Sabbath. So I remember my parents did not want to pump gas on Sunday. So sometimes they would go pump gas on Saturday. They didn't eat out on Sunday. They didn't do any work on Sunday. We cut out recreational activity on Sunday. So if I had any ball games, we did not go to them on Sunday. Dressing your best modest Sunday dress was a big thing. So no blue jeans. I remember when I was 11, I was wearing a dress with a little cleavage. And again, little, I was 11. And someone else's parent came and rebuked me. And I felt so uncomfortable and ashamed. So in the culture, there were a lot of people there to please, which was stressful for me as a child because I wanted to obey. I wanted to honor the Lord. I wanted to please my parents and all that. So I think there were a lot of critical people there, or critics. They looked down on people who public schooled, or for women who worked outside of the home, or other denominations in general. So I kind of grew up believing those were sinful deviations from the word. Like there were some extra commandments in there, thou shalt homeschool, thou shalt stay at home, thou shalt be Reformed Presbyterian, And I, just to be clear, I am a stay-at-home wife and I homeschool. So I'm not against those things, but they just seem to be more sinful in that culture. So I remember a lot of those criticisms came from the pulpit. And I remember Boyd, in one instance, he took down this cross that was hanging behind the pulpit because he thought the cross could possibly be a graven image and we would worship the cross and not the Savior. So he actually took it down and chopped it up and turned it into firewood and burned a fire at his house. And there were some other examples of the graven image, no nativity scenes. We didn't want to worship a picture of Jesus. So in our Sunday school material, we had these little stick figures and they had beige heads. So they're just like floating beige circle heads, totally faithless. I also remember the church overall, this is a generalization, but being dismissive of women's voices and children's voices. So they took verses like in 1 Corinthians, where it talks about women being silent in the church very literally. So after the call of worship, women were not allowed to speak in the service. So I remember whenever we had missionaries come and share, if the wife was going to share with the husband, it had to be before that call to worship. Also, at the same time, so the church had some legalism, but also there's some other issues that seem to be abusing God's grace. So there was some abusing alcohol and drunkenness, even with some of the elders of the church functions. There was some giving alcohol to kids underage. So there were some areas where we were like, okay, that's a Christian liberty we can take, and we're just going to take that Christian liberty. Scripture was often weaponized, I would say, to bring shame and guilt instead of bringing the hope of the gospel. Especially in relationship to forgiveness and peacemaking. So my family has a joke that peacemaking is really just peace faking in the OPC cultures. So forgiveness just meant like cover it in love, sweep it under the rug. There's really no consequences for sin because we forgave. But that was more pertaining to adults because I will say with the kids, there was very real and serious consequences for our sin. Okay. So different interpretations of forgiveness for adults and kids. And as for how Boyd was viewed in the church, I think overall the church would say he's a great preacher. He teaches through the Bible well. I don't remember people questioning him or complaining about his sermons or his behavior. So any criticism or critique, even if it was small, I think was met instantly with a fierce defense of Boyd as their pastor. I would say people love him And he was probably one of the top, people in our lives.
So as I've talked to others, Caroline before this, we're not talking about how Covenant OPC it's God's gift to the planet, nor is it nor is it a fantastic church. I mean, yes, it had good qualities and it had bad qualities, but that's not necessarily what we're talking about. We're gonna talk about some both undue attention, but then also some not just unasked for touch, but some inappropriate touch, some very inappropriate touch. We'll get into that. So when did you start noticing, or did you notice that Boyd's relationship with you was less pastoral, and did it morph into something personal or sexual, physical, or was it kind of always there?
So the first time I ever noticed anything that clued me into this relationship was a little bit off. I was very young. I was maybe 9 years old. And I remember I was sitting in Boyd's lap and I was kind of climbing all over him. And I remember later my parents came to me and rebuked me, and they were telling me I needed to be more careful. I needed to be more cautious around Boyd and just around the amount of attention I was giving him. And I was really confused by that conversation as a child. I was thinking, I'm the kid, he's the adult. But that was a very confusing conversation. And then similarly to Caroline's story, I think a pattern of grooming behavior began. So I started getting this special treatment within my family. I got handwritten letters from Boyd. One I still have from when I was 11 and he was 38 at the time. And in the letter, he compliments how I was an excellent soccer player. I had a deadly left foot. He loved my cheerful spirit and my smiling face. And he signed off with love. So I was like, oh, he loves me so much. I'm so special. I also had private Facebook messages from him starting from when I was 13. And I first got Facebook, when I was 13. And he would have been 40 at that time. He also called our house phone. Sometimes we had short calls. Sometimes we had long calls, going several hours. I would ride alone with him in his car from our church to his house. And sometimes a sibling would join in the back seat. And also as, the favored one where I got special gifts, special attention, he would let me drive his car. And I thought that was so great. He wouldn't let other people drive his car, but I was allowed to drive his car. So I told my parents actually this week about the letters and private messages and calls and emails as an adult, and they had no idea. He came to countless soccer games, birthday parties, family events, and actually an elder's wife complained to my mom that Boyd was always at my soccer games and he didn't come to as many of her son's soccer games. And there was another elder who pointed out Boyd never came to his son's football games. And Boyd loved football. Boyd and I would often talk about football. So he is a big Clemson fan and I was a Georgia Tech fan. And we would talk about this rivalry. Boyd would often put himself in situations where he was the only adult and with the youth in our church. So at the church, this looked like Boyd taught a Sunday school class for the youth, but it wasn't in the church building. It was in the building across the street from a church. It was a lawyer's office. And I think the reasoning was, there was no room in the church for the class, but interesting that he was over there with the youth just by himself. He would often have the youth over to his house on Sunday nights, and we would have spaghetti dinners that would just be him and the youth. He would come to pick up soccer games on Tuesdays, and he would be the only adult there. He also would invite the youth to his neighborhood pool. And I remember there being some chicken fighting happening in the pool. And if you're not familiar with that, chicken fighting is when someone gets on the shoulders of someone else who's standing in the pool and you fight and you're trying to pull the other person off into the water. And so you win whenever that person's like drowning or, pulled down under. So I remember as a teenager wearing a bathing suit and getting onto Boyd's shoulders and wrestling with other people in the pool in his neighborhood. So this was not a church event. This was just Boyd inviting teenagers to come hang out at his neighborhood pool and really putting himself in situations where he could have physical contact with us. That was a normal, I'm doing air quotes here, somewhat normal way. So during one of those pool events, there was actually a girl who noticed some stuff and had reported it, and she was playing chicken and she was on Boyd's shoulders, and he started talking about her body and her legs and how they were so muscular and strong. And she actually made a complaint to Jim Channel, and I'm not aware of anything happening from that. So then there are two very specific memories I had that I felt extremely uncomfortable with what happened. And overall, our relationship was very affectionate. So I have no doubt there are other times that boundaries were crossed that I just don't have memory of anymore, thank the Lord. But the first escalation, I would say, of the grooming process to go from physical to sexual touch was when I was 14 and Boyd would have been 41. So we were sitting beside each other on the couch and I was wearing shorts, and Boyd put his hand on my bare thigh, like my inner thigh, and he was rubbing my thighs for an extended time. I would say at least a minute, and I felt extremely uncomfortable and I wasn't sure what to do. So I did what any good peacemaking people pleaser would do at the time, and I didn't do anything. So the second incident that happened, I was at my parents' house and I was helping just set the table, and I walked past Boyd and he slapped my butt in a flirtatious way. And in the moment I felt this is wrong, but I didn't have the vocabulary or understanding to what was happening at the time. So I had very little, sex ed in the church world and very little understanding from when I was taught at home. So I'm going to read a definition of sexual battery from Georgia law. So sexual battery is when someone intentionally makes physical contact with the intimate parts of the body of another person without their consent. So it's usually a misdemeanor, but it's a felony if the victim is under the age of 16. So there's 3 elements of sexual battery. The first is that the contact is intentional. Like he didn't flip on the floor and accidentally grab me. The second is that the contact is made to a victim's intimate parts. So those include your genitals, anus, groin, inner thighs, buttocks, breasts, and this is as listed in the state of Georgia. And then the third aspect is that the victim did not consent to the contact, which if you're a minor, it's impossible to consent. And sexual battery can happen even with clothes on. So both of those incidences were sexual battery under the law of Georgia.
So with all of this attention, with all this touch, with his desire to be with younger girls and some teenagers, and him being in his late 30s, early 40s, it's not just the age difference, but also the underage and older age difference, and his pastoral duties as well. And on top of everything else, was the congregation or the leadership of Covenants aware of this stuff? Or was it kind of so normal, this is just what Boyd does? If they were aware, what do they say about it? If they weren't aware, was that because this is just that's just Boyd, that's the culture, that's what he does, he's just very affectionate? So what did that look like?
Okay, so again, being the people pleaser I didn't want any conflict. I didn't want anyone to get in trouble. I didn't want to say anything. But actually, someone who was dating my brother at the time went to my mom and my dad, and they told my parents, Boyd is sexually harassing your daughter. So my dad and my mom came to my room, and they asked me some questions. I confirmed what she said was true, and I just cried. And then my dad, who was an elder at the church at the time, was trying to honor, Matthew 18 that Boyd breaches. He went privately to Boyd, and Boyd actually denied touching me, but he said, maybe we were roughhousing and things got out of control. And, maybe I popped her on the butt with a towel in the kitchen. Maybe that's what she's remembering. So my dad didn't go to the full session at the time, but he did warn Boyd and told him to back off, to quit giving me special attention. And my dad said he had seen Boyd doing similar things to other young women, including Caroline, and they had quit coming to Covenant. So after my brother's girlfriend had brought this to my parents' attention and my dad went to Boyd, then I got this phone call. So I was 14 years old. I was with my cousins, and they live about 4 hours away from LaGrange. So I'm out of town, and he called my aunt's house on her landline, and he called to say that he was sorry he had made me feel uncomfortable, or if he had made me feel uncomfortable. And he didn't admit any guilt or sin, but he said he was repentant, and he was crying in this conversation. He was crying on the phone. He told me he hadn't been eating. He was very sick. He hadn't been sleeping. And I felt so horrible. I felt like his consequences were my fault. He made me feel guilty for telling my parents the truth. And so I thought this would be best if I never talked about this again. And I think that's exactly what he wanted to accomplish with that conversation.
So you've talked about, you noticed that this was happening at a fairly early age, but didn't have the language for some of this stuff. And I think that's what's confusing to many people. Like, why didn't she just call the authorities? Why didn't she talk to somebody? Why didn't she go to elders, whatever it is? And not to mention that the elders were under Boyd's kind of eye at this point too. Mm-hmm. When did you realize, I guess, was it like at this point, or was it later on that that what he was doing wasn't just like kind of playful, or like, oh, maybe just crossed a boundary? But from the definition you read, like this is illegal. This is not just crossing a boundary. This is illegal. This could be a crime. Did this happen at the time of Boyd's grooming and physical touch, or did this happen later that you realized, holy smokes, this happened to me?
Yeah. So I would say I knew, again, it was wrong enough that I did tell my boyfriend when I was 16. We had been dating just a few months, and he's now my husband. And I will say the first time I told him what happened, he immediately responded with, I believe you. And he just held me, and we cried together. Like, he didn't ask questions. He didn't, Romans 8:28, the situation, like, he just cried with me, and he believed me. And it was so healing for me to have like a safe person I could talk to about that openly and be believed. But to answer your question, I did not fully realize like the criminal, the illegal, or the sexual side until I was later on in my adult life. And I was actually going to seminary with my husband. And during our seminary years at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, we were learning all the do's and don'ts of like how to be a minister, how to be a minister's wife. And during that, I was realizing just how many of the don'ts Boyd had done with me specifically. So during our training, I learned about grooming, child abuse and prevention in the church, sexual abuse, mandatory reporting. And I have this now language and vernacular to use for what happened to me. I was groomed by Boyd. Touching a child under the age of 16's butt and thighs, even with clothes on, is sexual battery, and it's a federal crime. So if the correct steps had happened 15 years ago, the right charges could have been filed and police reports, and I have no doubt that Boyd would have been removed from being a pastor then and facing even criminal consequences. And I'm thankful there's little baby steps being taken out, but it's really too little and it's too late. I will also say I don't think my parents had the language or vernacular for what was happening to me either at the time. Not excusing their behavior that they didn't go make reports, but they also were ignorant of some of these things as well. So we had to go through ministry safe training and seminary, and specifically their training on grooming just caused a huge amount of anxiety. And I was realizing, oh my gosh, all the things that happened to me. And at that point, my husband and I started going to counseling together, actually, just because I was starting to realize all of the effects that this was still having on me, psychologically, physically, spiritually. So, yeah.
All right. So, second to last question. You, Theresa, and Caroline eventually reported this to the Presbytery of the Southeast, and we've heard the story. This is the same part of the episode that Caroline's going to be part of, and Theresa was on one 2 weeks ago as of when this publishes. So how was your report handled? Because this is some serious stuff. This is not just like, hey guys, Boyd messed up a little bit. With just one person, like he's totally sorry about it, and it was just a little thing here. But this is a pattern. This is something that you've done with multiple girls, not women, multiple girls that there could be more of. We're not sure of. And so what was that like? How was it handled, or was it explained away? And you were there. You were part of this. Your testimony was there. So from your perspective, what happened?
Yeah, so I have a lot to say on this point. So we were not actually the ones to initiate this report or to bring in the Presbytery of the Southeast. So to back up a little bit, a lot of my family members actually married people who grew up going to Covenant OPC in LaGrange. So my sister was the first one to notice this was a pattern of behavior in 2020. And she brought it up to her dad, who's an elder at the time. So she specifically was telling my dad, hey, Covenant needs better policies and procedures and boundaries and guardrails. And this whole session needs to be aware of what happened to me and what happened to others. So my dad had one piece of the story, but Jim Channel had several other pieces of the story, and they weren't talking about all of it all together. So my dad went to Jim Channel to discuss, bringing all this information to the session to consider. So before this, we know that Theresa had gone to Jim Channel and showed him that email sent by Caroline to her theater teacher. To my knowledge, Jim Channel denies seeing that letter from the theater teacher, but he recalls seeing a piece of paper in Theresa's hand. So he kind of drove a narrative that it was a he said, she said situation, that Theresa was just out to get Boyd. We know the pool incident was reported to Jim Channel and nothing happened. So when my dad went to Jim in 2020, Jim said this wasn't a good time for Boyd. He was going through some things. So it kind of further stalled action until March of 2024, when there was actually a wedding of 2 Covenant members. And there's a lot of Covenant youth in town who didn't go to Covenant the next day. They're all in town, they're all at the wedding, and then they don't go to church the next day. So there was some conversation going on as to why that was. And my dad in particular realized that there were some issues there going on. Despite Boyd telling the elders he had handled everything, all was well, all is forgiven. So my dad confronted Boyd about what was going on, and Boyd admitted to some spanking game, and he also said he said a few sentences to Caroline. So he told my dad he had a great relationship with Caroline, and the only person who had problems with him was Theresa. So my dad pressed him again to what happened, and Boyd's like, I only said a few sentences to Caroline, nothing more. So at this time, my dad talks to my brother to see if he had any issues with my dad or the church, because he's one of those people who didn't show up to the church. And my brother told him, Dad, this looks like old friends protecting the pastor instead of doing what's right. So my dad called the only other elder at Covenant besides Boyd and Jim Channel to share the conversations he was having with some of his kids. And that elder immediately was like, I think your kids are right. This is inappropriate. This is way out of bounds. My dad then went to my husband for advice. realizing a lot of the testimony they had heard about the situation was just from Boyd's mouth. So he wanted to talk to me again about what had happened and ask more questions, but he wanted to be sensitive about digging up old wounds and trauma. So it became clear in my conversation with my dad, while I'm telling my dad what the sexual touches that happened at the hands of Boyd, it became clear to him the number one witness in the case against Boyd was Boyd himself. So all of the testimony that had been heard at that point to the session was just whatever Boyd reported to the session. So after listening to me, the elders in the session reached out to the Garcia sisters to see if they'd be willing to share their testimonies. And my dad said, when the elders heard Caroline's statement, their mouths dropped wide open because it wasn't how Boyd described it to them, not even close. Boyd had told the session that the Garcias had all left the church because of a long drive. So it began with the session of covenant coming to us and asking us for our testimonies. They quickly realized that it needed to be handed over to the shepherding committee of the Presbytery of the Southeast because we were giving them other names of people. Hey, maybe this happened to this person, or maybe this person has known something or seen something, and you should talk to this individual. So I think they realized they were in over their heads, turned it over to the shepherding committee of the Presbytery of the Southeast, which was composed of 5 individuals at the time: Nathan Trice, Joby Fowler, Hank Belfield, Boyd Miller, and one other who didn't have anything to do with our investigation. Okay, so that was something not disclosed to us until much later. So it's of huge importance to note that Boyd worked with these men in similar investigations, and he had status and he had friendships with them.
Mhm.
So Nathan,
And something was known about him before this.
exactly. So Nathan Trice, he knew Boyd at least from back in 2008. Nathan Trice's licensure was actually at Covenant Presbyterian in LaGrange at Boyd's church. So Nathan Trice is the chair of the shepherding committee of the Presbytery of the Southeast, and he's a personal friend of Boyd. So the shepherding committee quickly put Boyd under a leave. I don't know if it was a leave of absence or a leave under investigation. And he helped the session communicate that to the congregation. But unfortunately, during that time when he was on leave under investigation, Boyd communicated to his pastor friends that he was on a sabbatical. So he actually taught Sunday school. He preached during that time, and he served the Lord's Supper at other churches during that time. So after we gave our testimony to the elders, then the shepherding committee reached out to us to gather our stories. So we already recounted them once to the session. Now we're giving our testimony again to the shepherding committee so they can compile a report with recommendations. So how they handled what I told them, the shepherding committee specifically, they refused to try to corroborate what I said, and they boiled it down to a he said, she said. So they didn't reach out to my brother's girlfriend who said, hey, he's sexually harassing her. They didn't reach out to another guy who had been a witness to Boyd touching my butt at a different incident. So he saw another incident, and the shepherding committee said they did not reach out to negative witnesses to corroborate because it could have gotten out of hand. So I have a quote from a debrief.
Yeah.
We're
going to investigate. We're not going to investigate that closely.
Exactly. So my husband is saying, hey, I have a question because I know when it came to the testimony of my wife versus Boyd, we referenced witnesses. I remember we told this session particularly about that. There is another witness and that there may be others. And I believe we mentioned that to you all in our first interview. Did you seek out or try to interview or get interviews from any of the other witnesses and names that we mentioned? Or was it only limited to the 3 ladies before you, Boyd, in the session? So Nathan Trice responds, and this is in our transcript. We did not seek out any additional testimony on either side. For example, we were asked in the congregational meeting when we made our presentation, "You've spoken with individuals who have brought allegations of misconduct." Although, by the way, we were very clear that we approached you, and we were very clear it was not your initiative to come to us. We were very clear about that. But we were asked by members of the congregation, "Did you go and get character references from those who don't have any allegations?" And my response, if I remember correctly, was, "Our investigation could have become entirely unwildly impossible to carry out if we had pursued every individual, either positive or negative, in their assessment of Boyd's ministry." And so we were content to speak directly with those that you named. It is astonishing that they believed good character references fell in the same level of priority as those who corroborate individual instances of sexual crime. So they didn't reach out to any of the witnesses that we gave them to corroborate what happened. Furthermore, the shepherding committee determined that formal charges couldn't be brought due to that 2-year statute of limitations that I'm sure you've heard about under the church book of order. But they chose to ignore. There's been recent changes to the book of church order to make exceptions for charges that were prevented from being brought. So if there's something preventing you from charges being brought at the appropriate time, like we were children, we did not understand what was happening to us, or we did bring it to the elders and then the elders didn't bring it to the session. There were several things, that prohibited us at that time from bringing these charges, and they did not see that. The shepherding committee, based on their understanding of that statute of limitations, they felt like the best course of action was going to be for Boyd to resign and leave his position, and then to have the congregation affirm that they want him to leave via a vote. So the elders, Jim Channel, my dad, and the third elder, they all recommended to the church, please accept his resignation. So the vote wasn't really a trial. It was just this formal process for the congregation to either accept Boyd's resignation or to reject it. So it wasn't a guilt or innocence. It was just, do we want him to continue being our pastor or not? So by choosing to do this vote process instead of formal charges, they excluded the victims from actively participating in the process, and they enabled Boyd to be the only party who the church heard from directly. And also Boyd's voice was heard behind the scenes because he's conducting his own campaign with the congregation, and he's also allowed to be present at the vote, which was not an opportunity we were afforded at all. So further, the shepherding committee de-emphasized the victims by only sharing parts of their full report with the congregation, and they purposefully softened the language for some motive that I'll let them defend. But from my perspective, it seems like it was designed to protect Boyd's future employment and ministry somewhere else.
Yep.
So when we pressed them on why they didn't use legal categories and language to describe to the congregation or even the presbytery what happened, they replied they were using church language, not legal language, because it was a court of the church. So they didn't take account the fact that special report they made to equip the officers to protect the flock, they used legal language, and it was given to the presbytery to help equip pastors to protect the flock.
11 years ago in 2014. It's been available.
So, Boyd had communicated to the shepherding committee, to our knowledge in the session, that he was going to resign regardless of the outcome. But then he retracted his resignation following the vote. So we heard from the committee, one person on the committee had said if he was Boyd, he would have resigned already. And another person on the committee said they felt certain it wasn't going to come to that. Boyd was going to do the honorable thing and resign. And that they said, the committee, that in other situations, Boyd had advised ministers to do the same. So in similar situations, Boyd had been telling other pastors, you should resign in this situation. So during that process, there were 2 ruling elders. One was my dad. They felt like they could no longer in good conscience stay at Covenant OPC under Boyd's leadership. And his continued attacks on the children he had groomed and sexually touched. So in the time between the first meeting they had as a church where the shepherding committee provided some kind of abridged report, and they had a week for the church to think about it and then vote. So between those meetings, Jim Channel broke off from the other 2 elders, and he just withdrew, I guess, his support of the recommendation to receive the resignation letter from Boyd. So after Boyd withdraws his resignation, there's just 2 ruling elders, which is Boyd and Jim Channel. So on top of that, the shepherding committee, they give the final report to the session of of Covenant Presbyterian, which at this point is Boyd, the abuser, and Jim Channel, who's covered over and over for him. So they have the report, the final report, the full report, not the abridged report or shortened one that they gave the church. The shepherding committee also gave the report to the Presbytery of the Southeast in an executive session during their October 2024 meeting, during which Boyd again was allowed to give his account of events, and the Presbytery considered the matter done and resolved because they didn't have anything to vote on. They just moved on, I guess. They were respecting the vote of the church, decided not to press charges, decided to take no disciplinary action against Boyd. So that was how that was handled.
All right. Not handled well at all, and covered up all over the place. And I want to press into it. I know I talked about it 2 weeks ago when we produced with Theresa, and then even last week talking about the PCA BCO. It's you guys went through the process. You guys you guys to the T went through the process exactly as the church officers and the OPC and kind of all the critics of those who cry out abuse say, well, did you follow Matthew 18? Did you follow 1 Timothy? Did you follow Titus? Did you follow all this stuff? And you're like, yes, we did. And look what happened.
Yep.
So if this is wild to everybody else, it should be wild to you, because this is what happens. So you follow the process, and they're covering. So final question, and then any final thoughts from you. If you could talk, and you can, and we know that they're listening. We know a lot of people are listening to this, and they can't speak back to you. If you could talk to the Presbytery of the Southeast, the session at Covenant OPC, and finally Boyd Miller, what would you say to them? And if you want to add anybody else to that mix too, that's perfectly fine, but we'll start it there.
All right. So to the OPC as a whole, what I would say is there is a need for abuse reform in your denomination. And many who have clearly acted in ways that display they're unfit to lead in this reform. I think it would be great if there was a third party to investigate and assess the culture, the policies, the structures of the OPC, and even at Covenant Pres in regards to abuse and responding to reports and allegations. So that's what I would say to the OPC as a whole. To the Presbytery of the Southeast, you have a report to the special committee to help equip officers to protect the flock, and you fail to use its guidelines, its language, and to implement it throughout this process. Nathan, I was extremely hesitant to participate in this process, as you know, and you convinced me that if I did not share my testimony, that there was nothing you could do. You then failed to contact any of the witnesses I provided to corroborate my testimony. You were too close to the person being investigated, and you failed to disclose that information to us until after the investigation. I am going to quote Nathan twice when he admitted to Boyd's guilt to sexual battery in a conversation with me that we will link with the transcript. He says, "And so you saw that at the very least we have one by his own mouth. We have one testimony from him," that is Boyd himself, "that on one occasion he inappropriately and sinfully touched a minor. And that was, as you said, legally speaking, a form of sexual battery." When you were asked by a member of the church if Boyd had done anything criminal, you did not answer honestly, but deceptively. You said something of the sort, no criminal charges can or have been filed, which you're relying on a technically correct, it was a very political answer to avoid the simple answer that Boyd's conduct was criminal, and charges cannot be brought out only due to a statute of limitations. That's what I would say to Nathan. To Hank, when asked if you believe, if it honors Christ, that Boyd is still the pastor at Covenant OPC in Grange, Georgia, you answered that you wanted to see Boyd resign. And Nathan, you also said, "We made one of our rationale for his resigning and the congregation accepting his resignation the honor of Christ in the church." And Joby, you said that you were saddened by the fact that he chose to remove his resignation and that you thought it was a bad decision. Ultimately, I believe you all had the opportunity to pursue formal charges of the accused, but instead you took the path of what you thought was going to be the least resistance, and you removed the agency of the victims you claim to represent. The path you chose censored our voices from this process and resulted in a failure to remove Boyd from ministry. So, when we asked you who benefited from this process in the end, I think my husband said it well. I don't want to speak on behalf of you all, but from my perception, the answer to this question is this process helped Boyd, because now Boyd is sitting there with a solidified leadership, having essentially a slap on his hand for what he's done, and a session member who's not going to hold him accountable. And the message is very clearly communicated to any girls that if he has, and I pray this is not the case, but any girls who this has happened to, who are sitting there seeing they're not going to be believed, their families are going to be demonized, and Boyd will be retained, and their credibility is going to get destroyed as a result of this. So it has now been turned into a hotbed for potential further abuse. So that's what I would like to say to them. To the session of Covenant OPC, specifically Gym Channel, I would like to see you held accountable for the fact that you've covered up legitimate reports and concerns that were brought to you. You recently blamed the Holy Spirit for just now convicting you. And then ultimately you decided to stay at Covenant after hearing all of our testimonies, basically telling the church, it's not that bad. You stood shoulder to shoulder with men who trusted you as an elder, came to the congregation, y'all were united in accepting Boyd's resignation only to draw back when things got hot and let the other elders be sacrificed in place of a guilty and a corrupt man. So I would ask you to resign from your role in leadership, since it is both those who abuse and those who enable them who bear responsibility. To my parents, to my dad and mom, I know that you have failed to take the right steps when this was originally brought to light. However, I have seen you both owning up to your failures in this process, and you've asked forgiveness from the church and from our family, and I'm very thankful for that. I cannot tell you how much relief and tears I cried when you finally decided to leave Covenant. After serving there and leading there faithfully for almost 30 years. I know it's a place you loved and people you love, but you did take a stand for what's right and just at a great personal cost to yourself. So I'm proud to be your daughter. I love you both. You have continued to point me to Christ, He's my strength. He's my confidence, my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, and I don't have anyone to fear. To Covenant, Presbyterian, and LaGrange, I would say I would like to ask for better guidelines, better church policies and procedures for reporting abuse. Please implement ministry safe training or something similar for your volunteers and your leaders in your church so you can better educate yourselves about grooming and about sexual abuse. If you are a member or a former member of Covenant OPC, and if you have seen any physical or sexual abuse, please report it to the proper authorities. Please do not try to handle it in-house. Please do not take it to the elders during the session. Report it to the proper channels. Unfortunately, whether it was a lack of information or if it was a lack of wisdom, you went against the counsel of the shepherding committee and of your session, and you will stand accountable before the Lord for your vote to keep Boyd as your pastor. I know he's a gifted expositor of the word, but all the gifts in the world do not excuse you from ignoring the qualifications for elders as spelled out in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 and 2. So you're choosing to ignore scripture about your qualifications from elders. Before I address Boyd, I would like to address any survivors or just the listeners in general. To my fellow survivors, when the world seems dark and heavy, and it's all you can do to breathe, John 1:5 says, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Psalms 34:18 says, "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted, and he saves those who are crushed in spirit." When we don't, and we might not see justice on this side of earth, I would like to remind you of Revelation 21. Very different. There might not even be a Revelation 21. Revelation 21. Then I heard a loud voice from the throne. "Look, God is dwelling with humanity, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and will be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Grief, crying, and pain will be no more, because the previous things have passed away." Then the one seated on the throne said, "Look, I am making everything new." He also said, "Write, because these words are faithful and true." Then he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will freely give to the thirsty from the spring of the water of life. The one who conquers will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son or daughter. But the cowards, the faithless, detestable murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their share will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death." So I'd like to say, because of abuse that is running rampant in churches and church leadership specifically, I know there are many walking away from the faith and the church entirely. And I want to implore you that what you see in the church is not what God intended. God's heart is for the wounded. His heart is for the poor and the oppressed and the lowly. God is a healer. When he came to earth, every step he took was driving back darkness, driving back the curses of sin. Everywhere he walked, he brought light and life. And salvation actually means to be whole. And I know the effects of abuse, sexually, physically, spiritually, it can leave a person feeling very broken. But God didn't just come to save me from my sins, but he came to make me whole again, to heal my hurts, to bind up my wounds. And I know he can do the same thing for you. So don't stop fighting the good fight. We still need people in churches who can point out injustice, who can point out sin, who can stand up for what's right and good. I'm still a churchgoer. I'm actually a pastor's wife. I'm fighting for a church where people who are broken and wounded and weary, they can come and find healing and life. So my hope for bringing truth out into the light is so that people can both see the evils and horrors and effects of abuse and sin, but at the same time, we can have hope. We can cling to what's good and true and beautiful about the world and what God has made. So I don't want to be overcome by evil. I want to overcome evil with good. Finally, to Boyd, you have led the church, the flock you were called to guard and protect. You've led them to demonize the victims who have come forward and their families in this process. You are continuing to add to hurt, downplaying your own personal sin, lying, manipulating, covering up what you've done. You have said that we need to do Matthew 18, and I would like to read Matthew 18, 1-7. At the same time, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And calling to him a child, he put him in the midst of them and said, "Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives such a child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to fall away, it would be better for him if a heavy millstone were hung around his neck and if he were drowned into the depths of the sea. Woe to the world because of offenses, for offenses will inevitably come, but woe to the person by whom the offense comes." I extend forgiveness and grace to you based on the forgiveness and grace of Christ that I have received, but that does not, and it should not, remove the consequences you face for your sins.
Well, thank you for that. For speaking to all those, and especially survivors, and bringing in the good news of the gospel for those who don't know a way forward. Any final thoughts? Anything that you want people to come away with this conversation, and whether it be abuse in general, or the church, or scripture, or wayward pastors, those who are not protecting the flock? Any final thoughts? Any final words that you want to leave those today?
I think there is a way forward. There is a better way forward. And there is, I think, better things for the church than what I've experienced. And I do pray that people who have experienced hurt by churches in any way just don't see that as a reflection of Christ and his character and his love for them. People aren't God. People don't represent God well or perfectly, especially in the church. So those are my final thoughts.
I want to thank both Caroline Osborne and the anonymous woman for sharing their stories with courage and vulnerability. As Caroline said, they're terrified. This isn't fun, but it is necessary. It might give you who are listening courage to tell your story. It might lead to change. Because the story doesn't end here. As the anonymous woman pointed out, even if Boyd doesn't face justice in this life, he will in the next. I'm not saying he's headed for hell. I don't know the state of his soul. But he will have to give an account. Every message, every touch, every intention not fulfilled but desired. Everything. Covenant OPC in the Grange will have to give an account. Their elders will have to give an account. The Presbytery of the Southeast will have to give an account. The Orthodox Presbyterian Church will have to give an account. Many of your churches harbor no abusers. But when you hear of another church, what do? Thank God that's not our church. Do you sit cozy? Do you defend the denomination saying, but that's not all of the OPC, or all of the PCA, or all of the URC, or all of the CREC? Do you ask those who point these things out to Focus only and exclusively on the bad churches. Don't talk to the good churches. If someone were a bystander to a crime, did nothing, what might you think about them? Not, well, they seem to be pretty good. There's no wrong in them. Of course not. You would say, why didn't you do anything? Because Jesus did. And Jesus will. He will wipe every tear from your eyes. He will kill death once and for all. He will comfort the mourners until they shout for joy. Heal all pains and give you resurrection bodies, without ailment or disease or memories of the past, and the fears and anxieties and injustices and wickedness and perversion and crime committed against you will pass away. Only righteousness and holiness will remain. That's why we do what we do, and that's what should have been done. And we look for the day when that will reign. Come, Lord Jesus, come quickly. Next week, we continue in our series, Profiling Abuse in the PCA. See you then.